Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske. She is professor of philosophy at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, and host of the Goodies in the Details podcast. And today we're talking about existentialism, feminism, the philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, and other related topics. So, Dr. Dolske, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So let me just start by asking you sort of a more general question. So you're a philosopher, and people who are not philosophers themselves or might not think that philosophy is that interesting of a subject. What would you tell them when it comes to the role that philosophy plays in your own personal life, and that it can also play in people's lives more generally?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to start out. A lot of times when I say I study philosophy or I teach philosophy, there will be some random person who will say, "Oh, philosophy, there's like no right answer." And then I have to stop and say, "Okay, let's examine that claim.
Yeah.
Let's do some philosophy here." If there is no right answer, then you're presupposing a definition of right in order for you to make that claim. So if there is no right answer, then that claim could not possibly be right. So that's what philosophy does. Philosophy examines the ideas that underscore our view of the world, our assumptions about the world. Philosophy is ultimately a wonderment. How does this work? How does that work? I also talk about it in terms of problem solving, but it's a unique type of problem solving. So, for example, I have my phone here. If we were to say, does this phone exist? It would be a very short conversation. If we were in person, we could use the five senses. You can hear it, I guess, smell it, see it, all the five senses to establish that this is here. Now, if I want to ask the question, what is justice? That requires a different set of thinking skills. We do not have the five senses to come to a conclusion because it doesn't occupy space. So I say philosophy is problem solving for things that don't occupy space, like what is justice? What is beauty? What is goodness? What does it mean to be virtuous, to be a good person? What is good character? And so those are the types of things that philosophy deals with. And when we have an understanding of that, like justice or rightness or wrongness, that underscores the way we can address things in our everyday lives, how we teach our children, for instance, do not steal. I mean, why not really? Like philosophy can answer the question of where do we get these ideas? But the same thing with our own judicial system in a court of law. It's important to be able to establish the distinction between rightness and wrongness before law can even be established.
So I'm a big fan of your podcast, Goodies in the Details. I've listened to a lot of its episodes. I mean, not all of them, of course, but lots of them. And I would like to ask you, what goals did you have in mind when you started your podcast? I mean, did you have specific goals in mind? And why do you explore the kinds of topics you explore there and try to expose them to a wider audience?
Yeah, I mean, it started out really as a hunch. So in teaching philosophy, I have a lot of students who come through for general ed, meaning that the university requires them, no matter what your major is, to take a few subjects outside of your major. The
Yeah.
overwhelming majority of my students in my philosophy classes are in that camp where they're majoring in something like engineering or literature, but they have to squeeze in an extra class. So I would have these wonderful conversations with my students. At the end of the semester, long after the semester, I'd get these emails saying they saw this movie that reminded them of something from our class. Just there was a lot of joy in being introduced to the subject. And so I had a hunch of why do we need to gatekeep this behind the university walls? This should be available for everyone. Now, it was just a hunch to go ahead and tackle some of these philosophical issues that we do on Goodies in the Details. But shortly in, it caught on to a broad audience, which is what I wanted. But I didn't I didn't really expect that. And so the success of the podcast has been very exciting, where we have academics from different areas. We have people from medicine to comedy and entertainment come on, and we want to get to the ideas that underscore their work. And the purpose of the show, I think, first of all, it's personal enjoyment. I can't get around that. If someone would be like, why do you do this? I'm like, because it makes me happy. It's just an absolute delight to be able to tap into some of the best talent and have an hour of their time to discuss their work. But the other thing that Rudy, my co-host, Rudy Salo, and I, we genuinely believe that one of the pillars to happiness and to enjoying one's life is intellectual growth, that foundation of curiosity. And so a lot of times when people talk about happiness, and this is 100% correct, we talk about the physical, like move, take a walk. We talk about the spiritual, which appeals to a lot of people. We talk about emotional things and relationships. All of those are part and parcel of a good life, in addition to curiosity and intellectual development. Another thing that we really want to have as our goal is that when somebody listens to the episode, that they learn something that they didn't know they didn't know. And we always say that that's in the spirit of Socrates. One of the greatest lessons, I think, that we learned from Socrates is this idea that when you dialogue with others, when you have this mission for self-improvement, that it requires engagement with others and not just a retreat from the world. But the more you learn, then the more humble you become. Not arrogant. Arrogance comes from when you think you know everything. Humility and curiosity and joy come from learning more and then knowing that there's more to learn. And so that's what Rudy and I are doing for ourselves. And we want the audience to be on that journey with us.
Great. So, I mean, the questions I'm going to ask you are most of them, at least, you explore in your podcast. And as a philosopher, of course, there are an immense amount of topics that you could be interested in, but I noticed that you are particularly interested in existentialism and more specifically the philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir. So what got you interested in existentialism and then her specifically?
I think I was in graduate school and I was assigned something by the philosopher Kierkegaard. I think it was either or. And after coming from a tradition of analytic philosophy, I was stunned when I was reading Kierkegaard. I was absolutely stunned at that. I didn't know that this type of thinking existed. Now, one of the things that I've loved that ever since I was a child is that I am a bookworm. I am constantly reading fiction. It is how I unwind. The way people do Netflix binges, for instance, is what I'll do with like mystery genres. I'm completely in love with them. So I had always separated that love for fiction from my enjoyment of philosophy. I loved the analytic tradition of thinking about what is justice, or how do you put together, arguments, and how do you dismantle arguments. It's a different type of thinking. It's more of like a mathematical type thinking, whereas fiction was for my imagination and joy. When I came across Kierkegaard, it was the first time that I saw you could do both. Oh, I think my daughter's going to come into the picture. That you could actually do both. And what I was going to say before I take off is that with Kierkegaard, the way in which he approached philosophy was he saw the analytic tradition, and he was saying we still need to know what it means to be human, that philosophy is avoiding the most interesting question. He said subjectivity is the case in point. It doesn't mean that everything is subjective. It's that the most unique and interesting thing about our existence is not discovering absolutes, but it's in understanding our unique position and the way in which we experience the world. And he used pseudonyms and a bit of fiction in order to make that point. And then I started to study that tradition, and I fell in love with Simone de Beauvoir. So then what got me into Simone de Beauvoir, I remember it specifically. Now, some people might not know this, people outside of academia, but Philosophy is a male-dominated field.
Mhm.
I never even read any women philosophers. It wasn't until I was in my first year of my master's program that I asked a professor, what are there any female philosophers? Like I didn't even know that if they existed or not. And so he gave me a little book by Hannah Arendt, and that was my first introduction to being like, oh, women philosophers do exist. Then fast forward about another year, it was a summer holiday, a summer break, and I decided to sit down and read the work of Simone de Beauvoir. I thought, who is this woman? So I did it on my own, never from a class or anything like that. And the first thing I picked up was her fiction, All Men Are Mortal. And I remember being at a cafe and getting that, and I didn't move. I was just so stunned and so intrigued by this novel that then I had to read everything else by her. And I think that it wasn't just that she was a woman philosopher. It wasn't just that she was an existentialist. I think the fact that she was also in literature and writing fiction in order to be philosophical was what really interested me.
Mhm. No, I have to tell you that I'm also very much into existentialism, and Simone de Beauvoir specifically is probably in the top three of my favorite philosophers. I mean, number one is Diogenes, number two is Nietzsche, and then probably Simone de
Really?
Beauvoir. I mean, Nietzsche, it's not because he's a man, of course, because it doesn't matter to me at all if someone is a man or a woman philosopher, but I just like him a little bit better than de Beauvoir, perhaps because he was very influential for French existentialists. But anyway, those are my preferences, and I respect de Beauvoir very, very,
Yeah.
very much. And talking about that, you're also interested in feminism. Where would you place de Beauvoir in the history of feminism? I mean, how important would you say she is in that history? And in what ways do you think feminism would intersect with existentialism?
Yeah, I think she's extremely important. I would say one of the first works of feminist writing in philosophy, it might go back to a thinker by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft.
Mhm.
And I always tell my students, I say, you may not have heard of Mary Wollstonecraft, but you've definitely heard of her daughter. So Mary Wollstonecraft was writing in the late 1700s. And it makes sense that in the West, where you had this upheaval of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, there was this upheaval in the West of we can govern ourselves. And Mary Wollstonecraft was very much situated in that time frame and writing that women ought to have the right to education. And in order for her to even make the point that women should be able to be educated, she had to backtrack about a lot of assumptions about women based on the body into which they were
Mhm.
born. Namely, this idea that for a woman to be virtuous or good meant that she was obedient. And Mary Wollstonecraft was saying, but that's not what virtue is. Virtue, by definition, is using reason to make ethical decisions. If you deprive a woman of education, you're depriving her of reason. Therefore, you're depriving her of the possibility of being virtuous.
Mhm.
So Mary Wollstonecraft really laid out this argument of the problems of presupposing what a person is capable of based on the body into which they were born. And she did that using virtue theory. 200 years later, you have Simone de Beauvoir. And
Mhm.
Simone de Beauvoir is in that same vein, but she's really picking apart this idea of existentialism that in existentialism, she is rejecting the idea of order. She's rejecting the idea that there is human nature. She is an advocate for freedom, that we always have choice. But something that she was able to accomplish that her male counterparts, people like Sartre, people like Camus, were not able to accomplish, is that she really drove home the importance of being in a body. And the history of philosophy with male thinkers have taken for granted the body. And it took somebody who was kind of on the outside of the tradition, like Simone de Beauvoir, to be like, no, wait, I have to interact in a world. I'm not just a mind. I'm not just a floating thought bubble that is being rational. I have to interact in a world that is hostile to me, that is telling me what I can and cannot do, that has created a bunch of rules for way I'm supposed to behave. So women would have this extra existential trek, if you will, that they're not just thrown into existence, but they're thrown into a world that is not structured for them. And so in order for them to be successful, they have these extra hurdles. That is extremely important that Simone de Beauvoir prioritized the way in which we are in a body. And that is how our freedom is engaged with that extra caveat. And the reason why Beauvoir is so important is because you can even look at the trajectory of feminist thought where it still has that same principle of let's have a conversation, an authentic conversation about what it is like to be born in a body, and that body is interacting or being commented on, treated legally, socially, economically different. And that opened up the doors for a lot of work, especially for women of color who have said, wait, the way that the world treats us is different from, let's say, a white woman. But we're able to kind of have conversations and understand that reality, I think, because Beauvoir was putting into the ethos, if you will, that it is relevant, that it is relevant. We can't just talk about, oh, you are free to make decisions to do whatever you want. No, that we kind of find out who we are in situation. And some situations are more complex or cause more of an obstacle than other situations. So as a woman, for instance, I have different obstacles in the world than a man does. And this can be like just in terms of the way that I'm treated, let's say historically, the way that women are treated economically, in athletics, in medicine, and that's something to take into account when we're figuring out our existence. So I think Simone de Beauvoir and feminism they're very, very relevant. They're very important. And I love how Simone de Beauvoir puts existentialism as the lens for feminism, where she's still highlighting the importance of subjectivity and the way in which the uniqueness of our existence. And if is it okay if I give an example? Because there's a novella by her that I'm in love with. It's that drives home this point to me. Now, this is a novella called The Woman Destroyed. And when I first read it when I was in graduate school, it didn't really resonate with me. I loved All Men Are Mortal. I loved The Mandarins. And then, of course, her philosophical pieces like The Second Sex and The Ethics of Ambiguity. But later I reread The Woman Destroyed and I thought, it gave me pause. Now I'm 46, 20 years away, over 20 years from the first time I read it. And I read it over and over again for one of the classes that I teach. And without exception, every time I read it, I have to sit down and be alone with myself because I am just astonished at what she accomplished in this novella and why I didn't get it when I was in my 20s. And at the time that Beauvoir published this, she was older. And so she's writing in a diary format, the trajectory of the demise of a woman who, this woman, Monique, is writing a diary about how her life is falling apart. Her kids are grown and her husband is moving on with the mistress. And she doesn't know what to do. And so this question of destroyed is so important because you have to ask yourself, what is being destroyed? Is it the version of herself or is she destroyed? And the reason why it always resonates with me now is because there's such a difference between being a feminist in your 20s to being a feminist in your 40s. When you're a feminist in your 20s, you're rejecting this idea that you're only good for X, that you're only good for reproduction, for instance. You're only good as a wife and a mother. In your 40s, you're rejecting the idea that you're not good at all because you're past the baby making point. So the feminist in her 40s has a different calling, being like, I still matter. I still exist. Whereas in your 20s, you're like, I don't just exist for you. In your 40s, 50s, 60s, you're arguing that you still matter because everything is placed on that baby making era, the goodness of woman. And the tragedy of The Woman Destroyed is that Monique bought into the idea that that was her value. And she's finding out that it's not. And everybody's moving on. Her kids are moving on. Her husband is moving on. And I think it's such an important lesson because it is this idea of accepting that there is truth in our choices, but also trying to sit back and wonder what choice was mine. Am I just living according to what other people decided was of value for me? How do we find out what is valuable? And then also we have that opportunity to grow and change. Just because you thought something was really cool in your 20s doesn't mean it still has to be cool in your 40s. You can do whatever you want. You can train to run a marathon. You can redefine yourself. You can say, you know what, I'm going to learn how to cook. I've never cooked before. You can say, I'm going to learn Sanskrit. I don't know. Like, there are all of these possibilities in what it means to be human. And the scary part in the novella, The Woman Destroyed, is how often we ignore all of the possibilities and potential for our life. We're not just a thing. We're not just a role. And that is an existentialist and a feminist position. And also keeping in mind that Simone de Beauvoir was born, I want to say it was like 1908, 1906 or 1908, that her love of literature and philosophy, she didn't have a huge catalog of women to read. So what she did is she starts to introduce different female characters who have different points of view. Whereas before her, a lot of female characters, when they were introduced, the fact that they were women was the character. That's it. But what Simone de Beauvoir in her novels and novellas is giving different character traits to different women. And she's doing that and pioneering that. There wasn't that much to go on with writers before her. There's a few, but not that many.
You know, one thing that I find really interesting about all of this is the ways in which feminism might intersect with existentialism. Existentialism in its more individualistic aspects, because when it comes to the feminist side of things, it seems to me that there are these sort of common experiences that someone who identifies within the social category of woman tend to experience collectively, but also there are individual traits that different women have, and that's where each of them might develop differently, even though they might share a common experiences socially, politically, etc.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the United States, there's definitely, I want to figure out how to say this. I'll just give the example of white women and Black women, American women. There's a really different experience of the world, and something that a lot of Black women writers and thinkers have tried to, and I think successfully, I don't want to say just tried, but to really flesh out that distinction, that importance, and that it's not, it's not nothing. It's treated differently. Women are treated differently economically in interpersonal relationships. And so I think that what existentialism allows us to do is to step away from categorizing and really respecting and honoring that there are different things in life, or there's different rules. There's a lot of rules that people are supposed to be following that are simply the creation of man, and it can change. But I think that existentialism gives us that space to appreciate and acknowledge that when somebody is saying, this is my experience of the world, to take that seriously.
What does it mean to not really being born a woman, but becoming a woman? What does that
Yeah,
mean?
it is, I'm wondering if anybody really did that before her. And it's so funny today that this book, when she wrote that, is 80 years ago. And today in the United States, there's a lot of tension over this idea of, what do you mean? What is a woman? Like, kind of mocking this idea when it comes to issues with transgender people. And I'm thinking Beauvoir raised this 80 years ago. And it's what she is talking about. I'm afraid I'm gonna like BuzzFeed this, make it too small, but it is so interesting that the idea of what it means to be a woman cannot just be reduced to physicality. It is something, or biology. It is a cultural thing. And I know today there's a lot of resistance to that because of the issues of transgender. But I mean, all you have to do is go around the world and see what it means to be a woman. You can see that there are different expectations. There are all these cultural things that are embedded. And if we say that like today, if you were to say, well, what is a man? And you were to describe a man as like with short hair and wears pants, that's absurd. I can show you a picture of people throughout history of men who are definitely men, but that is not the costume they were wearing at the time.
Yeah.
So what she is saying is that to be a woman is not the same thing as female, which is an idea of the biology, but the woman is a type of, what Judith Butler would call it, a type of performance or presentation. It's abiding by a lot of rules. This is really important. I'm trying to collect my thoughts on this because this actually reminds me of what Mary Wollstonecraft a couple hundred years later was trying to say, is that trying to make a person fit into what you think is natural is problematic. And that's what Beauvoir is also tackling, is that women are reduced to nature. They're naturally X or they're naturally Y. And it's incredibly problematic because there's no evidence as to what the nature of a woman is. So if somebody wants to say, well, women are naturally, mothers or instinctual, or they naturally want to have children, or they should have children because that is natural. And you notice that that always goes for women. We don't talk about men naturally that way in the same way. Men naturally, we say like, oh, they're rational. They naturally want to go and create and build, but women are supposed to be making babies because they have that capacity. So this is one of the problems with it. And this is definitely me being influenced by Simone de Beauvoir, is that because you have the biological capacity for something, it doesn't follow that you should do that. We're putting that burden on women. You have the biological capacity for lots of things. The human brain, for instance, has the biological capacity to know several different languages. Would we tell men you should, or you ought to know 6 different languages fluently because it's naturally you're capable of doing that. Therefore, you're wrong in not doing it. Or here's another thing. The human body is capable of long distance movement. That's one of the distinguishing traits of Homo sapien. How many marathons have you done? It's natural. You should do that. No, but we're so comfortable saying that because women have this biological capacity that then they should do it. But we don't do that burden in any other way. The reason why I don't do marathons is because I don't want to. That is not how I want to spend my life. I can't imagine if somebody were to be like, but you should be, you ought to. It's moral for you to do it because it's natural. No. So why would we do that when it comes to children? And we don't do that for men. Men are the causal factors for pregnancy. We don't say like, oh, you're supposed to be doing that. We never reduce men to their biological capacity in the way in which we do that to women. So that's where I think this idea of becoming a woman is really saying you're culturally ascribing to all of the do's and don'ts of that society in that given time frame.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that if we would equate good with what is natural, then we would get into very muddy waters, because it's also natural for women to very frequently die when giving birth. It's also natural for infants to die during birth. It's also natural for people to die at 35 or 40 years old. So
well, what you put there, that's the other very interesting thing to me, is this assumption that nature or natural is goodness, because all
Yeah.
of human history, what we have done is try to interrupt nature.
Yeah.
That's what technology is. That's what medicine is. So
Yeah.
we don't look at a hurricane and be like, it's natural, it's good, don't do anything. Or we don't look at cancer and be like, it's natural. Everything that we do is to interrupt the natural course of thing. I mean, even us having this conversation, it's not natural. We're the
No.
internet, like doing this. So I don't know why there is that presupposition built in there in terms of natural that is never really addressed or explained, because in other areas of our life, we don't really put it up here. We're trying to do everything to not be natural. And yeah,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Spot on.
And what does it mean to live, particularly from an existentialist perspective, authentically? What does it mean to be authentic?
From an existentialist point of view, authenticity, and I like the word authenticity as opposed to rightness or wrongness.
Yeah.
What it means to be human. So it's kind of tricky because the existentialists have to come up with a definition at the same time saying that they want to avoid definitions and absolutes. So they came up with something that can encompass all humans. There is the fact of your existence, namely when you were born, the body into which you were born into, your first language, geography, economic bracket. Like there are all these facts of your existence, your
Yeah.
nationality. And that's part of what it means to be human, that you have these facts. Then there's also the reality of being human is transcendence, which means that you're not just the physical facts of your existence, you can do more. What it means to live authentically is to accept these two parts of your existence. So, for example, if I were to say that, oh, I can't study philosophy, I'm just a woman because it's a male dominated field, that would be bad faith. That wouldn't be authentic. I would be denying something that I really enjoy. The transcendence is that it is possible for me to study more and to do more, to not just be in this state of knowledge, but to do more. That would mean being authentic would be understanding that I really love philosophy and to pursue it more. It would be bad faith to say I'm just a woman. That means I'm forgetting the transcendence part of my existence and just relying on the facts of my existence. It would also be inauthentic for me to say, you know what, I can be in the WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association. I'm 5'3" and I'm terrible at sports. That would be me saying, like, yeah, I can do it. That would be me being like all transcendence and not facts of my existence. So to be authentic is to be in accepting of those two parts of what it means to be human. Don't say that you can't just do something because of, the just because of the age and the time in which you were born. Have some kind of love and appreciation for the time in which you were born, the body into which you were born, but never use that as a limit to the things that we're capable of doing, creating, projecting ourselves. Beauvoir wrote about that action is project. We're literally projecting ourselves onto the world. When you create something, when I do the podcast, when I do Good is in the Details, I'm projecting myself. I'm doing the project, putting my stamp on something new in the world, as are you by doing this. So those are the types of things that we want to take into consideration. What does it mean to be authentic? Am I just living according to a cultural norm that I didn't create, that I didn't invent? And to find happiness in that way. Like, again, that was Monique's downfall in The Woman Destroyed. She just subscribed to cultural norms and that was it. So authentic is when you can have that space and think about what it is that you enjoy. What do you want to think about? Are you saying that you like something or doing something just because somebody else said for you to do it? That's what it means to be authentic, I think.
And apart from being authentic, what does it mean to lead a good life? How do we determine what a good life is? I mean, is that something that I can do individually for myself, or do I have to follow specific steps to find that out?
I think this is something where I'll get into the philosophy, because the philosophy of Camus really, really stood out to me. I also fell in love with his work. one of his, famous works in terms of fiction is The Stranger. It's like it's a staple that's read in high school. I have to tell you, I fell in love with Camus' work when it came to the novella The Fall. And it's another one of those books that I've read over and over again, and I always have to sit with myself afterwards. And also The Myth of Sisyphus. I'm going to yield to Camus here, where he is talking about living well or enjoying your life requires letting go of this idea of order in the world. He talks about the absurdity of existence, not as a negative thing, but he says you have to breathe with the absurd, and it can strike anybody at a street corner. And that for me was a really beautiful and interesting view of existence. If we are trapped in this idea of order, this is the way things should be, we are going to suffer a lot, because the reality of things is that that's not the way life goes. Like if somebody passes away at a young age and we say, or they shouldn't have, or it's not supposed to be that way. While the death is tragic, obviously, if you are trapped in this idea of that's the way that wasn't supposed to happen, you're going to have a bigger existential hurdle than if you accept that the world is a contradiction, has absurdities. And then when you breathe with it, you're able to have more freedom and more happiness. And at the end of The Myth of Sisyphus, something that really caught me, I had to sit and think, what the hell is Camus talking about? But for any of your listeners, the myth of Sisyphus is the ancient Greek myth where Sisyphus is condemned for all eternity to push a boulder up a hill, only for when he gets up, it falls down, and then he has to go and push it back up. For all eternity, he's pushing this boulder up the hill. And Camus challenges us to think about our own boulders, if you will. And Camus also says at the end of The Myth of Sisyphus, after this analysis of it, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I am telling you, I didn't see how. And when it dawned on me, the one thing that Sisyphus is in control of is the way in which he views that situation. The gods were going to punish him by giving him something that they thought would be miserable. But Sisyphus is still in charge of the way in which he thinks he goes down that hill, the way he pushes it up. He still has control and freedom in those moments. And that's what it means, I think, for authentic living, to enjoy your life. You cannot be condemned. You have to allow that space that you have the freedom to interpret whatever situation you are in. You don't have to take somebody's harsh words, for instance, as a declaration of who you are. You can say that person's crazy and toxic, and I'm going to withdraw my energy instead of focusing in on what somebody else wants to tell you. When somebody else wants to tell you what your value is or what you're supposed to do, you can exit that and think differently of it, and think differently about what your potential or possibility is, what you want to do with your time. So I think, I think that living well and good is to be engaged in the way in which you're participating in the world. Be engaged. Don't be afraid of limitations that other people want to put on you, right? Like if somebody says you're too old to do something, like you're too old to learn how to do blank, forget it. You're not. You can do whatever you want. It is such a strange feeling when it hits you. Like Camus said, you can be at the street corner and the absurd hits you. When it hits you, that you can do whatever you want. You can think however you want. And when you are honest about that, then you're able to be more receptive to other people's humanity as well. When other people feel stuck, or if they're in a system that is trying to pin them down, when you understand the value of freedom and that space for thinking, then you're able to appreciate people when they're in a situation where somebody is trying to put them down, and to try to assist in that freedom and alleviate that pain or that injustice, I think.
Great. So I guess this is a good point to ask you about, let's say, a question related to how we relate to other people, because of course human life is not just about us as individuals, but also there's a big element of our social lives, how we relate to other people in different ways. And I know that you teach, for example, courses on the philosophy of sex and love. That's a very big component of how we relate to other people. So I mean, from perhaps again an existentialist perspective, what would you say? How do you look at how the sexes relate to one another and the role that things like love, romance, and sex play in our lives?
Yeah, it's, there's been recently a lot of work on, I know it's an American culture. I can't speak for other areas of the world, but that there's been
Yeah.
a bit of a demise. Um, there has been this perceived threat to men and what is considered to be masculine. And so
Yeah.
there's been this backlash of of anger between the sexes in terms of heterosexual relationships. And because there's been this upheaval in the United States of this questioning of just the very things that we've been talking about, like, do I have to get married? Do I have to have children by this age? Can I take care of myself? And so there have been a lot of shifts, and I want to say a lot of it came from the 70s in that, and this is, so again, I want to make sure that I'm clarifying, this is in American law,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
there was a big shift. I want to say it was at the very end of the 60s. One of the biggest shifts when it came to relationships is that in some states, it was up to the states who they would marry. So it could be illegal to be, or it could be perfectly legal to be in a state where the judge would not marry you based on race. And that was just in a few states, not every state. The Supreme Court ruled that that was illegal in all 50 states. That was a really big shift in the understanding of love, because remember, law is the expression of our values. And so when the law made it that it is legal for you to marry somebody that is not of the same race, that started to put into motion this idea that you are allowed to love and to be engaged with people of your choosing. Like, this
Mhm.
restriction is lifted. It's not, it would be considered illegal. It would be considered in this country very dangerous for Black men to be in relationships with white women. It would be a threat to their lives. That's how serious it
Yeah.
was. So just on the cusp of the 70s, you have this big shift in what is legally allowed in relationships. Then you have this big shift where Title IX is introduced. And Title IX in the 70s said that any public institution had to give an equal amount of funding to women's groups, sports, as to men. So the
Mhm.
concept of the female athlete is really born, because before that, women could play sports, but there was no coach, there was no team, there were no uniforms, there was no equipment. Now that exists. And now all of a sudden, young girls in, let's say, junior high and high school, they have something to do after school. They're not just thinking about their boyfriends. They're not just thinking about how pretty they are for their boyfriends. They're thinking about a personal goal where they're working with other young women to achieve something. That's huge. That changes the mindset, right? All of a sudden, women have something other to do than worry about their boyfriends, or if they're going to be picked to be married or whatever. They have goals now that
Mhm.
belong to them. And then the other change is that in the late 70s, women could have their own checking account, their own banking account. This changes everything. Oh, and no fault divorce. I'm sorry. Also, this means that women, well, you could leave a marriage based on the fact that you don't want to be there anymore.
Mhm. Yes.
Before that, you could only get a divorce if you could prove, and it would be up to a judge to decide that your spouse did something wrong. You would have
Mhm.
to prove that. So, and it didn't go over well. Like, there were some judges that would say things to women like, well, he only hit you twice. Like, it would be up to a judge to decide if you could leave a marriage. So, no fault divorce, meaning that you don't have to prove this something did something wrong. You can
Mhm.
simply just leave, exit that relationship because you don't want to be in it anymore. Those things changed the trajectory of relationships, because relationships before then depended on economics, meaning you did not necessarily have to love who you were married to. You just had to be provided for. Women had to be provided for by their husbands. And if the husbands wanted to climb the corporate ladder, they had to show that they were protecting a wife and kids. So people, desire or attraction was not part of the equation. It was just economic survival. You remove economic survival because all of a sudden women can have their own checking accounts. Women do not have to be married in order for economic survival. They can have their own goals. All of a sudden, men are like, making money is not sufficient for them to have a wife.
Yes.
And for women, like they have all these other choices. And so I don't know. I think that made improvements. This is my point of view, but some people say that was a detriment to relationships. From my point of view, the fact that when you are with somebody, it is not because you have to, but it is because you want to. And the fact that you can exit that relationship is actually what gives that relationship its value. Knowing that every day when you wake up, you are choosing to be with that person and respecting the fact that that person is choosing to be with you. That is what gives its value. The fact that they could choose not to. The fact that when they are with you every single day is a testament to their appreciation and reaffirming the choice. It's not that you just got married one day and you don't have to think about it anymore. It's the fact that, yeah, you do, and you constantly have to work together and evolve is what gives it its value. And so the dynamics have shifted. And like I said, there's a lot of people who are not on board with this shift. They want to say that women are just good for making babies and for taking care of the home. And then when they say things like that, women will say this too. This isn't just men. When they say things like that, then people are saying, well, you know, you're just not valuing my choice. I mean, I think there's also this unnecessary tension by suggesting that women who want to be stay-at-home moms and take care of their children, and they enjoy the domestic labor and they enjoy taking care of their man, that somehow that is negated or not of value, or that you're not allowed to want everything all at once, like have the career, have the children, have the hubby. Like there doesn't need to be that tension. I think the most important thing is you allow people to discover what works for them, and there shouldn't be a legal hurdle from that. So the most important things is the legal hurdles removed, saying that a woman like couldn't exit a relationship or couldn't have particular jobs. That's the most important thing, but culturally it's taking some time to pick up on that. One second. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, there are many aspects to all of this. I'm going to comment on a few of them, and please feel free to comment on what I'm about to say. But I guess that, first of all, I think it's a bit silly for people to just assume that women back in the 50s, 60s, and even before that were happy just being housewives, because we know that many of them took psychiatric pills and got drunk because they couldn't stand their marriages anymore, but they just couldn't opt out of them. And then, I mean, when it comes to this more recent backlash, of course, I think it derives very much from this sort of cultural norms, this cultural legacy that we have from these gender roles that were established decades ago, centuries ago, and we still live with that, or at least people still have that in their minds collectively. But also, I guess that another aspect to consider here is the fact that economics changed a lot, particularly after the 2008 economic crisis. I mean, it's much harder now for people to get stable jobs, to get a good income, and also that also influences people settling down or getting partners. Because I mean, I always look back to Japan, for example, in the late 80s, early 90s, where they had a big economic crisis, and it was exactly at that point where marriage rates started plummeting, and we have many more single people now, because before that people went to university and then they had a guaranteed job because there were this sort of uh, private public relations between the state and certain big companies in Japan. So whoever finished university until up the late 80s would have a guaranteed job for life. So it would be almost impossible for them to be fired and all of that. So there's also that component. And also, I mean, I think there's also the component of since women started going to university and they found out that they could have their own careers, earn their own money, they could be more independent. And many women nowadays just report that they like that kind of thing. I mean, they like to be independent, they like to earn their own money. And so many women nowadays just look for things in their partners beyond them earning more than them or something like that. And if men get into this sort of red pill, black pill manosphere
Yeah.
movement on the internet and so on, then they hear all the time that it's all because of feminists, all because of women being hypergamous or something like that, then perhaps they don't develop the sorts of traits that many women nowadays prefer. I mean, I don't know, what do you think about all of that?
I do. I think one of the mistakes, and this is one of the issues with the whole nature thing, or one becomes a woman. The idea is that there was just this, binary idea of what it meant to be a man versus a woman.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is that actually, this is from Mary Wollstonecraft to Simone de Beauvoir, is that a lot of the things that were deemed masculine are just human. And so, like, me studying philosophy is not me being masculine, it's me being human. Or, this idea, like you said, independent, that's not being masculine, that's just being human. That's what human beings crave. They like creativity. They do like family relationships. So by the same token, men who enjoy being fathers, taking care of their babies, taking care of their children, that they're not being feminine, they're being human. That's what it means to be a parent. So a lot of these ideas about what constitutes femininity and masculinity, if you notice, a lot of the stuff that's described as masculine is actually human. And then what is described as feminine is almost animal-like, like the way we would describe a dog as being good dog, a great pet, obedient, does what it has all these lessons. But what it takes to become feminine, to become a woman, requires a lot of training. So, for example, I have a daughter, as you've seen her like run around and everything. She is no different from the little boys in her preschool. Just wants to run around, makes messes, falls down, wants to climb stuff. That is just human. Over time, what people will do is they'll start to say like, oh, quiet, shh. They'll try to, quiet her or say, why don't you play with the doll instead of the ball? Like so being feminine requires not taking up space. It requires being small, being quiet. And that is anti-human, and that is training. Like, that's what that is. And I think the same thing for young men told not to cry. Now, crying is a human emotion, but being told not to requires a lot of training and a lot of stuffing down of feelings that ends up exploding. So this, what Beauvoir was suggesting, this idea of, becoming a woman is really led to the trajectory of masculine and feminine. When we just scratch the surface, it's not a natural state at all. It's not. Now there are, by the same token, I happen to like a lot of things that are feminine. I mean, I get my nails done. I get my hair done. I like pink. I can't help it. I just do. I will like pink. There are things like that. But I don't want to be pigeonholed in that I'm not allowed to because I'm a feminist or something like that. You know what I mean? I think that we just have to give people the space to be. And the thread, when I've thought about it with this backlash, I haven't totally understood it. Like, why is it that people are so upset when men will be a little bit more feminine or women are a bit more masculine? Like, why are people so angry about that? And I think it has to do with an economic structure. It has to do with power, that femininity is not, it does not yield like any kind of economic power. And so when a man displays anything that would be deemed feminine, it's such an insult, a loss of power. Or if women display any masculine traits, it's a trying to take of power. When really what we are doing is we're just being. Like, that's what it is. It's not trying to, like, me having my own checking account, producing a podcast, getting sponsors, making money from that, and then also being in the university system is not me trying to claim power from somebody else. I'm not trying to take away from anybody. It is just me expressing myself. And same thing with, I think that's what Beauvoir was really advocating for. When you read her work, it's not, a lot of it is following the trappings of not being authentic. It's not like this girl power thing of Wonder Woman and women taking over or anything like that. When you read her stuff, it's cautionary to see what happens when you don't live your authentic self. I think I lost the original question there. I hope that works.
No, I mean, I just put on the table several different thoughts that I had about where this backlash comes from and what led to the sort of dating slash mating context that we live in right now. And I just wanted for you to comment on that. I mean,
yeah, it's huge. Well, I'll give you one example.
Yeah.
This was so disturbing and so upsetting. And I brought it up with my class because the philosophy of sex and love class, the subtitle of it is Current Debates in Sexuality, which means that whatever's going on in the news, I didn't realize there was so much sex in the news, but there is. Like, ever since I've been teaching this class, I'm like, something comes up all the time. But this came up, this is really, really disturbing. And it generated new laws as a result of this. But, you know, Taylor Swift is like, after Time Magazine's People of the Year, she's on top of her game, right? And what was the backlash to that? Somebody decided to generate AI pornographic images of her and put it on the internet. And it took a good like 10 to 12 hours before that was taken down. That is now illegal. Right now, they have to create a law to say it is illegal to make pornographic images of somebody. But the pornographic images were extremely demeaning in a sexual manner. And that is the backlash that Taylor Swift got for what? What did she do? What was her crime? Being a successful woman in her industry?
Yeah.
That's the crime. So how are we going to get back at her? We're going to show what it looks for her to be in, not just sexual, but in demeaning, to reduce her to an animal status as something that is to be used. That is the kind of backlash that people get. And it's similar with racism, that when somebody is at the top of their game, then you'll notice that the reply will be reducing that person, will be like going to some sort of a racial or ethnic slur. And here is the thing, or when it comes to sexism, racism, or ethnic type of slurs, the one thing that we can say when that happens is that means the person who's throwing that out has nothing. They have nothing. They've got nothing to say except for that, except for something that is, it's an effort to try to bring somebody down when you've got no reason to put them down. It shows that you've got nothing up here. Because what is the argument against Taylor Swift, right? What is the argument when it comes to, let's just say, like Beyonce, who's also an extremely talented artist and is just extraordinary? what is left but some sort of a combination of racism and sexism. And why? It means you've got nothing. It means you have nothing intellectual to say. And we saw that with, we've seen that with different figures, whether it's political or athletes. When that stuff comes out, I would really like for it to stop. But when that stuff comes out, it also just goes to show the terrible weakness in whatever the backlash is and this attempt to hold on to power, because it's always going back to some sort of a power structure that is being eradicated, and which we realize that power structure was based on nothing. Like when it comes to racism, that power structure was based on a perceived hierarchy that was arbitrary. It was arbitrary. And when somebody wants to go back to that by using that kind of language, they, in existentialist terms, they're not being authentic to themselves. They're appealing to a structure that is just nothing. Like it's just nothing. But that's the kind of thing that when we're talking about sexuality, and backlash, when women are just claiming their own space, when people of color are just claiming their own space, just claiming to take up space in their talent, the resistance to that gets uglier the more powerful they are. But that ugliness also tells us how much that needs to be eradicated as well, and how weak it is.
So I was also interested in hearing your thoughts about the sex industry and sex workers, because I know that, for example, among feminists, this is also a very contentious topic. There are I know that these are not the precise terms, but I will call them sex positive and sex negative feminists who are completely against the sex industry, pornography, prostitution, and all of that, and others that are not against it. They are not necessarily for, but they are not against it. So where do you stand on that topic, since we're also talking here about sex?
Yes, I think there's a lot to unpack with this topic. I've thought about it. In the United States, it's illegal. I think when it comes to sex work, I think the parameters are when it comes to, if it's okay if I'm explicit, but I think it's any kind of penetration, I think any kind of exchange of fluids, then that's when it is illegal. But if it is, if that does not take place, then it's legal. So you can do like internet type stuff. You can be a stripper, dancer, like that's all legal. It's all under the umbrella of sex work, though, is essentially when it's some sort of an exchange for money for some sort of sexual gratification, pleasure, and some of it is illegal, some of it is not. And I've been thinking about why is it that sex work, let's say when it comes to something like prostitution, why is that illegal? Because normally when it comes to something needs to be illegal, it presupposes there's some sort of harm involved. Any law you look at is an attempt to alleviate or prevent or minimize harm. So when you look at business is legal and sex is legal, so why would it be illegal to mix the two of them? And I was trying to find the harm. And I found it, but it's not, or I think, this is my theory. I think that what it is that when it comes to women's sexuality, the man historically has always benefited. So let's just say in a Western wedding ceremony, you've got the woman is in white for the bride. That's to represent her virginity. That's sexual. She's pure. She's in the white. And then her father is walking her down to give her away. So she is the property of her father, and she is pure. And he's got this hot commodity that he's walking down the aisle. And then is asked who takes her. And it's the next man. And then her name is transferred from her father's to her new husband. It's a transfer of property. Don't mention this if anybody's getting married anytime soon, it'll ruin it. I don't think that women who are genuinely excited to get married now are like, I can't wait to be like transferred, and I don't think dads who are so proud to be walking their daughter down the aisle are like misogynistic people. Like, I'm just talking about the tradition itself. how I'm going to get back to this is that you can see that men are the ones who have been exchanging the woman.
Yeah.
When women are getting money for themselves, that's the offense. Women are now trading their sexuality, and they are the recipients of the funds for that, not somebody else. And
Yes.
I think that is the offense. I think that when it comes to sex work, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that it's the women who are shamed. It's mostly women. Men do, there are male sex workers, but it is primarily women because it's primarily a male clientele because men are the one who are seeking that out more.
Yes.
And the women are the ones who are shamed for it because of the idea that they're not supposed to want sex, they're not supposed to get money for it, but men are not shamed in the same way because we treat men as though it makes sense that they're sexual. So I think that when it comes to our attitudes of sex work, we have to really pay attention to, first of all, it makes a lot of money. That's the reality. Women who are on OnlyFans, or they are, they're making a lot of money through sex work. And that also seems to be the other offense. And if you really want to do something about sex work or minimize it, you have to make other options appealing. I mean, if you can make more money in sex work than you can getting over 100 grand in debt from an education, or to become a lawyer or a doctor, or to be a teacher, right? Like you have to make the other things more appealing. I would like to get rid of the shame around it,
Yeah.
but I also have to be completely honest. This is a complicated topic. I absolutely despise the idea of shaming a woman who is making money. I also want for her to be protected legally because that's also vulnerable for abusive situations. And if you're already doing something illegal, it's infinitely more difficult to go to the police and say, get protection, because in the United States, that's illegal. If they are killed, right? Nobody's looking for them. So that kind of thing absolutely crushes me. I can see it in our own American politics right now, the way that this trial of Donald Trump is being handled, that both left-wing and right-wing media are disparaging Stormy Daniels, who is the adult film actress. That's kind of the impetus of all of this. And both the liberal left, they will always say porn star Stormy Daniels. And why are they doing that? They're highlighting the fact that she is in sex work to embarrass Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump, by the way, to be clear. But if Stormy Daniels had any other profession, if she was a dentist, how often do you think they'd mention dentist Stormy Daniels and her
Never.
case against? They're using that they're degrading her, the implication, to embarrass him. And right-wing media is doing the same thing. They are talking about her as a porn star in order to embarrass and diminish her credibility. Why would he be with her? And so in this climate, if you were in sex work, you were less than human. You are not protected. And that's awful. And then when you make a lot of money at it, then you're even more despised. So this is the complexity of it. So I want to be 100% transparent. I have a daughter, the one that you've been seeing running around. If she were to say this is what she wants to do for a living, for a profession, I would want her to do something else. So that's the complexity of it, right? Like, if I'm being transparent, I don't want any woman to be in danger. I don't want any woman to be shamed. And at the same time, it's not a profession that I think that I would want my daughter to aspire to. So that's where I have to be completely honest. And then I have to think about why. And it's because maybe this is like the second wave versus the third wave feminism, right? There's a part of me that would just, that I think that there would just be more to enjoy out of life. so at the same time, I never like, I don't know. It's a complicated issue.
Mhm.
And I think that it's important, I mean, that I am transparent about
Mhm.
that. Like I can't run around and pretend as though that is something that I would say that I want for my daughter to aspire to in the same way I want for her to aspire to other professions.
Mhm.
So, but what I would love to do is just create a society where that is beneficial, where that is a path, or that men have authentic relationships with women in their lives where but it's like, well, what is the draw to sex work? Why are you spending your money on this?
Yeah.
What is going on? Is there some way for you to get that in your interpersonal life, to be honest about your own sexuality, to be honest about what you want in the bedroom, so that you don't need to go outside of a relationship to go pay for it elsewhere? Like there's also so much that's closed in
Mhm.
relationships. Like I'll give you an example. When this was early on in Good is in the Details,
Yeah.
I was in touch with a professional dominatrix, and she had a dungeon in downtown LA, and she invited for me to come and interview her, and she has a PhD in psychology.
Yeah.
And she and I are about the same age. And I invited my friend who's also in academia that I met through Simone de Beauvoir conferences, Dr. Ellie Anderson. And Ellie now has her own fantastic podcast called Overthink that's also philosophy based. And so I asked Ellie if she would come with me because Rudy's very conservative and he's a big wig lawyer. He's like, this is not for me. And I'm like, I study philosophy. I can do this. So, and I was also curious, right? I was just totally curious. So here's a woman, this is under the umbrella of sex work. She has a PhD in psychology and she has a place and toys. And yeah, I want to go see. But something that really stood out to me was that all of the evidence of being more honest with your sexuality, and if it includes the deviant stuff like BDSM, that when people are allowed to express that, they are healthier and happier in their everyday lives. And that she has men who, she is the only person in a
Mhm.
lot of men's lives who are familiar or know what their needs are and what they want. And
Right.
she is able to offer that to them with
Mhm.
100% secrecy, privacy, but they are able to explore a part of themselves with this woman that
Yeah.
they're not able to anywhere else. And so I think to me, that's one of the issues, especially when it comes to these ideas about masculinity and femininity. What is it that men are afraid to admit that they want from a partner? And the more open you are, then you can find the right partner or partners. If you want an open relationship, a polyamorous relationship, a non-monogamous relationship, but you still want your person, but you want all these other things. And so that's also important when we're talking about sex work. I think that our fascination and our demonizing on the women who are making money is one of the biggest cultural problems.
Mhm.
Um, but it's also why is the industry there in the first place, and to have an open and honest conversation about that.
Yeah. So let me just quickly give my 2 cents on the topic, and please, if you agree or disagree with anything I'm about to say, uh, tell me so. But I mean, this is a very complex topic. I agree with you, but I've read a ton on it from both sides of the aisle, the feminists who are in favor of it, the feminists who are against it, and also some empirical research. And I guess that the ideas that come to mind are that, of course, there's the harm side of it, and I guess that with that in mind, at least in certain circumstances, it would be good for it to be legalized because that way it's easier for sex workers to get access to help, to denounce particular situations, to persecute particular people, and so on. It's easier for them to do that way. And also, when it comes to, I've heard, this is very interesting. I've heard a discussion one time between OnlyFans girls. It was three of them. They were debating a conservative guy, and one of them said that he asked them, "Oh, would you, if you met a girl and she was saying that she would like to be a OnlyFans cam girl or something like that, what would you tell her? And she was very honest and said, well, I guess I would tell her that it would depend on her personality traits, because I like being an OnlyFans girl, but it's because of my personality. So I don't know exactly what kinds of traits she was referring to. I would imagine, like, in the case of being an escort, scoring high on sociosexuality, like liking to be with multiple uncommitted partners, something like that, or perhaps when it comes to personality traits, being more open to experience, something like that. I mean, I don't know the exact details there. And then when it comes to things I've read from sex workers themselves, of course, there's a multitude of different experiences that they report, but some of them actually report positive experiences with their clients, and some of them even mention, for example, when it comes to clients with certain needs, men with disabilities, for example, that they are the only way they can have access to sex and be sexually satisfied, because otherwise it's virtually impossible for them to have sex with women or with whatever kinds of partners they prefer. And then there's also organizations out there, like, for example, I've read about organizations in the UK and the US, specifically in Las Vegas, I think, where ex-prostitutes organize and they go out on the streets and they identify people who are selling sex, and they approach them and give them a pamphlet or something like that and says, look, if you are ready, or if you'd like to leave this business, your work, then come to us, we will help you. So I think that's also very positive. I mean, those are just the immediate thoughts that come to my mind. There would be many, many other things to talk about, but what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think one of the see in the United States there are also we just have weird feelings around sex and sexuality, and so this idea of it being just this idea of it being like a fun or a pleasurable experience, like there's something very funny about hi about American culture, where we just we make sex sound like it's just completely private and dirty, and there's only one way to do it and things like that. And so when I think that's also why sex work has become so, or is so popular, it's because that's not the way that sex works. It's not just like this. It's not just to make a baby real fast and then that's the end of the story. You know, there's a way, there's a lot of closeness, there's communication, there's playfulness, and we don't ever talk about sex in that way. In fact, a lot of places in the United States, if you get sex education, it's really just describing a fertilized egg. It's not actually talking about sex. And so people are just confused and not understanding, or they're taught that it is just some dirty thing that you're maybe only supposed to experience with one person. And so then you have, like, you know, what you're talking about, where there's this people are enjoying themselves and there's this playfulness to it. And one woman who was in sex work, she described it to me. She said, I provide an experience, like a masseuse she was describing.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'd never looked at it that way. But I think that one of the assumptions is that people who are in it need to be rescued, and they don't want to. But there's a lot of women and men as well that this is something that they want to do. The money is good, it's fun, it's playful, and they enjoy it. So I think that, again, one of the things that I think when we start to have a better idea about sex education and the value of healthy sexual relationships, and by value I mean that it's a form of communication, closeness, a way to understand yourselves, it's a very human thing, then you can start to see the decrease of the phenomenon or the allure of sex work as a profession. Like there are so many things that need to be in place, but as long as we are secretive about sex or talk about it as though like certain positions or certain ways of doing it or wrong, you're always going to have that sex work where people are going to find it and, you know, seek it out. They're going to do it when people are not open. But I do think the idea of being rescued, I don't think that applies to everyone in sex work. And so,
Isn't it also a little bit condescending, or can
yeah,
it be a little bit condescending?
yeah, yeah. Because some women, like, I mean, I think I know what show you're talking about, where they have a conservative person and they have sex workers on their OnlyFans. And there's just such a disconnect. I mean, as far as a show, I guess it works because you've got like these two
Yeah.
opposite sides of the spectrum. But what I have noticed with shows like that is that the men seem so comfortable in the way in which they disparage the women, the
Yeah.
way in which they talk about them. Like
Mhm.
Candace Owens, who's a conservative thinker, she was on a show like that, and she said to these women, I think your hoe life is fascinating. It's hoeflation. And, you know, hoe short for slang for whore. And I was just stunned. This is a woman who talks about her Christianity, and she's sitting there and talking about women as though they are nothing to their faces. And it was just like, it was just extraordinary to me that she felt so comfortable in talking to these women and just to their face calling them that. And it's a way to just flatten somebody's personality. So women who engage in sex work, women who make money from that, don't forget, like they also have friends. They have
Yeah.
family members. They also want to go to the movies. Maybe they thought the end of Game of Thrones sucked too. Like they have all these other parts to them, and we're willing to do that for any other employment, right? Like I think, I mean, my students know, for instance, that when I'm on campus and I'm teaching and I'm the professor, that is just one way of me being. But I clearly am a mom also. I'm also a partner. I'm somebody who likes to cook every once in a while. I'm somebody who likes to go on hikes every once in a while. Like there are all these other aspects to my personality. We know that for every worker. We know that when you go to a restaurant and you're ordering something from a server, you know that they have an end to their shift, that their whole life isn't about bringing you food. But Candace Owens and some of these other thinkers are perfectly comfortable in treating a woman who is making money and actually has work hours as though that's her entire life and she has nothing else outside of that. And therefore, it's okay to talk about her like she is a thing. So, or he, like I said, men do this as well. It's mostly women, but men do it as well.
Also, sorry for interrupting, but I guess that when it comes specifically to conservative women, and some of the sex negative feminists are also conservative, is that they look at female sex workers as competition. So,
I think that's part of it. I think it's because, I mean, that's who their husbands are going to, right? Like I think that's part of I think that's part of it. And I think one of the other like myths that have been taught to women, is that your power is in your sexuality and in your appearance. And women who have bought into that are the ones who are angry, right? Like,
mhm,
but the truth of the matter is that that's not your power doesn't come from your physical appearance. Your power comes from your capacity for empathy, listening, learning, being curious. That's genuine power. Even
yeah,
financial power, right? Like a lot of women are bought into this idea that if you spend all your money on plastic surgery or expensive bags, you're going to be more powerful because your power is in your looks. When actually, if you took that financial money, if you took that money and invested it, bought more property, for instance, you've got a lot more power. So we've convinced women that power is in their capacity to look young and to be an object of desire. And if you buy into that, then you're going to be angry at women who have successfully become an object of desire. You're going to be pissed at them because you're perceiving that that is power.
yeah.
And it's not power.
Great. So, Dr. Dolsky, I'm getting really mindful of your time, so perhaps it's better for us to wrap up the interview here. Maybe if you're open to it somewhere in the future, we can do a second
Okay,
episode.
yeah. And I'll have a better backdrop.
Just really quickly before we go, where can people find you on the internet, and in which places can they find your Goodies in the Details podcast?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Goodness in the Details is available on all platforms. Apple, Overcast, Google Play, Spotify. I'd love for people to check out the show. It's definitely one of my favorite things. It's one of my favorite things to do, to learn, to grow. And Good is in the Details pod is on Instagram and is also on Facebook. And for my personal page at Prof. Dolsky, that's me on Instagram.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And thank you so much for doing this. I really loved the conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.